Los Angeles in 1984 was a restless city, alive with flashing lights and sleepless dreams, where palm-lined streets hid both wealth and ruin. The air was thick that summer, heavy with heat and something else, an unease that crept through neighborhoods like a whispered warning. No one could name it yet, but something had entered the city, something that would make even the bravest men double-lock their doors and pray through the night. Richard Ramirez came with the shadows. He was tall, gaunt, with long dark hair and a stare that seemed hollowed by something not human. When he walked the streets of Los Angeles, he blended in like a ghost, just another drifter in black clothes and worn sneakers. But when night fell, he became something else entirely, a predator, a servant of the darkness he worshipped. Within months, his name would become a curse whispered across California, the Night Stalker. Richard Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas, in 1960, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class family. His father, Julian, was a former police officer who became a construction worker after moving to the U.S. He was known for his temper, a man who could snap in an instant. His mother, Mercedes, worked long hours in a boot factory where chemical fumes filled the air. It was said that those fumes caused birth defects in children of many workers, and later, doctors speculated that this might have damaged Richard's developing brain. But even before science could weigh in, there was something undeniably off about him. He was quiet, thin, always drifting. His teachers said he seemed lost inside his own head. At home, he was beaten by his father, often locked in closets for small mistakes. He began sleeping in cemeteries to avoid the violence. There, lying between tombstones under the desert sky, he found a strange sense of calm. Death felt more honest than the world around him. The turning point came when he was 12. His cousin, Miguel Mike Ramirez, returned from Vietnam, a man changed by war. Mike would sit in their living room showing Richard Polaroids, photos of decapitated women, mutilated bodies, the kind of horrors a child should never see. To Mike, they were trophies. To Richard, they were lessons. Mike told him about stalking, about the thrill of killing, about power. And Richard listened. He listened with fascination, with hunger. Then one afternoon, everything changed forever. Mike's wife, Jessie, began arguing with him. In a flash of rage, Mike pulled out a revolver and shot her in the face. Richard stood frozen as she fell to the floor, blood pooling at his feet. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just watched. When the police arrived, Mike was taken away, but the image of that moment, the sound of the gunshot, the sight of death, stayed with Richard. It became part of him. By his mid-teens, he was smoking marijuana daily, stealing cars and breaking into homes. He fell in love with horror movies and rock music laced with satanic imagery. By 17, he had left home for good, drifting between relatives, sleeping in parks, and surviving on theft. He was tall and skinny, his eyes sunken but alert, his teeth beginning to rot from neglect. He started breaking into homes, not just for money, but for the thrill of entering someone's private world while they slept. It made him feel invisible, powerful, godlike. In 1983, he left Texas and came to Los Angeles. The city seemed to him like a feeding ground, windows left open in the heat, people trusting the night to stay quiet. It was perfect. He lived in cheap hotels downtown, survived on junk food and cocaine, and started watching people. He watched their routines, the lights they left on, the sounds of their locks clicking. He studied them the way a wolf studies prey. His first murder came on June 28, 1984. The victim was 79-year-old Jenny Vincow, who lived alone in a small apartment in Glassell Park. That night, Ramirez climbed through her window. When she woke, he stabbed her repeatedly, then slit her throat so deeply that her head was nearly severed. Afterward, he ransacked her apartment and left. Police found fingerprints on the window screen, but there was no match in their system. The newspapers barely mentioned it, a robbery, they said. But to Richard Ramirez, it was more than a robbery. It was a beginning. For 9 months, he vanished from police radar, but he was not gone. He was practicing, watching, choosing his next victims. He began reading books on Satanism and claimed to have made a pact with the devil. He believed Lucifer protected him, that no matter what he did, he would never be caught. Every night he prowled the city like a phantom, slipping in and out of neighborhoods, waiting for fear to return to him. In March 1985, the killings began again. Maria Hernandez, 22, was coming home from work in Rosemead when a man in black appeared in her garage. He lifted a gun and fired. The bullet ricocheted off her keys, sparing her life. She ducked and ran as the man entered the house, where her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Okazaki, was hiding behind a counter. When Dale peeked up, he shot her point-blank in the forehead. Hernandez heard the gunshot and froze outside, realizing her friend was dead. An hour later, in a different neighborhood, a woman named Cy Lyon, Veronica, was pulled from her car and shot twice. Ramirez disappeared into the night again. Los Angeles was shaken. It was not just the brutality, it was the randomness. Old, young, rich, poor, none of it mattered. The killer moved like smoke across the city. Residents began sleeping with lights on, dogs were bought in record numbers, and hardware stores sold out of locks. Police called him the Valley Intruder, but the press soon gave him a new name, the Night Stalker. Through that spring and summer, the terror spread. Ramirez broke into homes across Southern California, moving from suburb to suburb. His methods were unpredictable. Sometimes he used a gun, sometimes a knife, sometimes a tire iron. He attacked couples in bed, shot men first, and then assaulted their wives. He forced some victims to swear to Satan as he tortured them. He drew pentagrams on walls and sometimes on the victims themselves. He left shoe prints from a rare Avia sneaker, size 11.5. That single detail would later haunt him. In one of the most brutal attacks, 64-year-old Vincent Zazzara and his 44-year-old wife, Maxine, were murdered in their home. Vincent was shot in his sleep. Maxine was found in the bedroom, stabbed and mutilated. Her eyes had been gouged out and taken from the scene. Detectives, hardened men who had seen everything, walked out of that house pale and silent. It was clear now. They were hunting something far worse than a thief or killer. They were hunting a sadist who killed for pleasure and ritual. Detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo were assigned the case. Salerno was already famous for helping solve the Hillside Strangler murders years earlier. He was calm, methodical, and relentless. Carrillo was younger but sharp, intuitive, and driven by an almost personal rage to stop the killings. They began connecting the murders, matching ballistic evidence, footprints, stolen items. Slowly, the pattern appeared. Every attack was linked by the same kind of shoe print, the same cruelty, the same ghost who slipped away before dawn. By late summer, the entire state was in panic. Newspapers ran front-page headlines about Satan's serial killer. Talk shows speculated about a cult. Parents refused to let their children sleep alone. And through it all, Ramirez watched the coverage. He loved it. He saw himself on TV and smiled, knowing the whole city feared his name without even knowing his face. But his arrogance became his undoing. In one of his last attacks, Ramirez stole a Toyota and left fingerprints on the rearview mirror. Detectives rushed to process it. Fingerprint analysis was slow in the mid-1980s. Each print had to be checked manually against records. But after days of waiting, a match appeared. The name came through: Richard Ramirez, 25, of El Paso, Texas. Now they had him. The next morning, the LAPD released his photo to the public. It was everywhere: newspapers, TV, flyers. Every person in Los Angeles saw his face. And then, almost instantly, the city turned from victim to hunter. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez returned to Los Angeles from Arizona, unaware that his face was on every front page. As he stepped off a Greyhound bus downtown, he noticed people staring. He walked past a newsstand and froze. His mugshot was staring back at him under the headline, "The Night Stalker." He ran. He tried to steal a car, but the owner screamed for help. Neighbors poured out of their houses, recognizing him from the papers. They chased him through the streets of East LA, armed with pipes and wrenches. Someone hit him over the head. Another broke his hand. The mob dragged him to the ground and began beating him as police sirens wailed in the distance. When officers finally pulled him out, he was bleeding, handcuffed, and laughing. "I'm me," he shouted. "The Night Stalker." The city that had spent a year in terror now roared in triumph. The devil had finally been caught by the same people he had hunted. In the days that followed, police uncovered a mountain of evidence: stolen jewelry, weapons, shoes matching the avia print, and items taken from victims' homes. Richard Ramirez sat in a cell, smirking, flashing the pentagram tattooed on his palm. When reporters asked him if he felt any remorse, he said, "No big deal. Death always comes." To him, the nightmare was over only in geography. His mind was still lost in the dark, somewhere between violence and worship, somewhere beyond understanding. The Night Stalker's reign of terror had ended, but for Lowe's angels, the fear would linger for years. The scars were invisible but deep, the kind that made people lock their windows forever. And for Detectives Salerno and Carrillo, it was only the beginning of the next battle, because catching Richard Ramirez was one thing. Convicting him, understanding him, surviving the circus of his trial, that would be something else entirely. The news of his capture spread across Lowe's angels like wildfire. The next morning, headlines screamed his name: "The Night Stalker caught." On TV, reporters stood outside the East LA police station, describing how an angry crowd had beaten the most feared man in California into submission. People who had spent months sleeping with baseball bats beside their beds finally exhaled. But behind the walls of the station, detectives knew this wasn't over. Now came the hard part: proving that Richard Ramirez, the gaunt 25-year-old drifter with bloodshot eyes and decaying teeth, was the man responsible for a year of horror. When Detectives Salerno and Carrillo walked into the interrogation room, Ramirez was sitting calmly, one leg crossed over the other, smiling faintly. His face was bruised from the mob's beating, but he didn't seem to care. He leaned back, watching them like a man who knew he'd become famous. When Salerno introduced himself, Ramirez grinned. "I've been waiting for you," he said. His voice was low, lazy, almost amused. They began with the evidence: fingerprints from the stolen Toyota, the rare avia shoe print left at multiple crime scenes, jewelry and weapons recovered from his hotel room. Ramirez shrugged. "Everyone's got shoes," he muttered. "Lots of people wear avias." But when they showed him photos of the victims, his expression changed, not remorse, not fear, but fascination. He studied the pictures like art. "They all had it coming," he whispered. "No one innocent ever dies." Detectives quickly realized that Ramirez wasn't like other killers they had interviewed. He didn't kill for money or jealousy or revenge. He killed because he liked it. He believed he was chosen by Satan to spread fear. He said it gave him power, that fear was better than love. Salerno watched him carefully, nodding every word, every smirk. He wasn't sure if Ramirez truly believed in Satan or if he used it to justify his own darkness. Either way, it was clear he enjoyed the performance. The police had more than enough to hold him, but building the case was complex. Ramirez had murdered across multiple counties: Los Angeles, San Francisco, Orange. Each jurisdiction had its own detectives, evidence rooms, and legal teams. Coordinating it all was chaos. Still, the trail of horror tied neatly together through forensics and witness testimony. Surviving victims identified him. Fingerprints matched. The ballistic evidence linked the same .22 caliber weapon to several murders. It was one of the strongest cases California had ever built against a serial killer. As the investigation deepened, the public obsession grew. True crime magazines printed his photo on covers. Women wrote him letters in jail, some even sending nude pictures, convinced they could save him. Others saw him as a symbol of evil itself, a reminder that monsters don't come from movies. They come from ordinary places like El Paso, from broken homes and empty streets. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. TV vans followed the detectives to work. Everyone wanted to see the face of the devil up close. Inside his cell, Ramirez seemed to enjoy it all. He drew pentagrams on the walls and spoke to other inmates about Lucifer. He bragged that Satan had protected him from capture until the end, and that the mob who caught him had only succeeded because the devil allowed it. Guards described him as eerily calm, always smiling, always polite. But when lights went out, they heard him whispering prayers backward in the dark. In 1986, a grand jury indicted him on 14 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The trial preparations dragged on for years. Ramirez fired his attorneys multiple times, demanded delays, and claimed his constitutional rights were being violated. The cost of security alone reached millions. Every day he was escorted to court in shackles, grinning at the cameras. When asked if he understood the charges, he replied, "Yeah, I'm guilty of being a rock star." The courtroom became a theater of madness. On the first day of trial in 1988, he entered with long hair, black sunglasses, and a pentagram drawn on his palm. As reporters shouted questions, he raised his hand and yelled, "Hail Satan!" The room gasped. Families of victims broke down in tears. Some jurors looked away. It was as if evil had taken human form and was proud of it. The judge warned him to control his outbursts, but Ramirez thrived on attention. Each appearance became a performance. He laughed when witnesses described the murders, winked at women in the gallery, and mouthed lyrics from heavy metal songs under his breath. One court reporter later said that sitting near him felt like being close to a cold furnace, no heat, just darkness. Prosecutors methodically laid out their case. They showed photos of the footprints, the weapons, the jewelry recovered from victims' homes, the ballistic evidence tying the same gun to multiple killings. They called survivors to testify, men and women who had looked into the Night Stalker's eyes and lived to tell about it. One elderly woman pointed directly at him from the stand, her voice trembling as she said, "That's him. I'll never forget those eyes." For the first time, Ramirez looked down. It was only a second, but it was the first flicker of discomfort anyone had seen in him. Still, by the next day, he was smiling again, licking his lips at the cameras as he walked in. Outside the courthouse, the crowds grew larger. Protesters held signs demanding the death penalty. Others, bizarrely, held signs proclaiming love for him. One woman fainted when she saw him enter, later telling reporters she felt his energy. The media fed on every moment. Talk shows debated whether he was insane or purely evil. Psychologists tried to explain him. Some blamed childhood trauma, others pointed to brain damage, still others said he was a textbook psychopath. But none of it seemed to capture what people truly felt. Ramirez didn't seem like a man gone mad. He seemed like a man who had chosen to be what he was. The trial stretched for over a year, plagued by delays, appeals, and courtroom stunts. In one chilling moment, a juror failed to appear in court. Hours later, she was found shot to death in her apartment. Panic rippled through the jury box. People wondered if Ramirez had somehow ordered a hit from jail. The judge assured them it was unrelated, that it was a domestic issue, but fear spread anyway. Some jurors requested security escorts home. The idea that even from behind bars, he could still inspire terror, only deepened the myth surrounding him. Through it all, Ramirez remained unbothered. He claimed Satan was watching over him, that he couldn't die until the Dark Lord said so. He scribbled symbols on his legal papers, smiled when witnesses cried, and whispered to guards that fear is better than mercy. In 1989, after more than 4 years of delays, the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed, victims, families, reporters, curious onlookers. When the foreman read the verdict, guilty on 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries, there was silence. Ramirez sat still, expressionless. Then, as deputies moved to take him away, he smiled at the families and said softly, "No big deal. Death always comes." When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Ramirez leaned toward the microphone. "You don't understand me," he said. "You never will. You're not capable. I am beyond good and evil. Lucifer is my brother. I will be avenged." Then he smiled that same hollow smile and added, "I'll see you in Disneyland." The courtroom erupted. Families shouted, reporters scribbled, guards dragged him away. The judge sentenced him to death, sending him to California's death row at San Quentin. As he left, Ramirez turned to the gallery and said, "I'll be back." Outside, people cheered. They hugged strangers. For the first time in years, Lowe's angels felt free. But for those who had lost loved ones, freedom felt hollow. They would never unsee what he had done. And for the detectives who had spent endless nights chasing his shadow, there was satisfaction, but also exhaustion. Frank Salerno later said, "He wasn't a man. He was a disease that infected a city." In San Quentin, Ramirez adjusted quickly. He became a celebrity among other inmates, receiving hundreds of letters from admirers. He played the role of the unrepentant killer, talking to journalists about Satanism and destiny. When asked if he regretted anything, he laughed. "Regret is for losers," he said. "I am what I am." But behind the walls, time moved differently. The years blurred. Other killers came and went. Other stories filled the headlines. The Night Stalker faded from public memory, but inside that prison cell, he remained exactly who he had always been, calm, cold, certain that he was untouchable. The devil had found his home, and the city he once terrorized could finally sleep again. Yet even then, as the lights dimmed in Lowe's angels, some who lived through that year swore they could still feel it. The heaviness in the air when night fell, the memory of the days when evil walked among them and no one knew where he would strike next. The gates of San Quentin slammed behind Richard Ramirez in 1989. The city outside exhaled in relief, but the man who once haunted Lowe's angels didn't seem to care. Death row wasn't punishment to him, it was promotion. To Ramirez, this was the final stage of his legend. He'd entered as a nameless drifter and now wore the identity of the Night Stalker like a crown. He believed he had achieved what he always wanted, immortality through fear. Inside his small concrete cell, Ramirez created his own kingdom. He spent his days listening to AC/DC on a prison radio, drawing pentagrams on scraps of paper, and writing letters to admirers who saw him not as a monster, but as a misunderstood soul. Within months of his conviction, the letters began to pour in, hundreds of them, from women all over America and beyond. Some wrote prayers, others confessions, and some sent him explicit photographs. They called him Rick, Richie, even my dark prince. It baffled everyone. The man who had raped, tortured, and murdered without mercy was now a magnet for obsession. Psychologists called it hybristophilia, an attraction to criminals who commit violent acts. To Ramirez, it was proof that even behind bars he had power. He could still reach people, still infect their minds with fascination. He bragged to guards that Satan rewarded him with disciples, that women were drawn to darkness because light is boring. One of those women would change the last chapter of his life. Her name was Doreen Leoy, a magazine editor who began writing to him in 1985 during the early days of the trial. At first, she told herself she was studying him, trying to understand how evil is born, but her letters grew personal, affectionate. She said she saw humanity in him, that beneath his crimes there was a wounded boy who needed love. She visited him regularly, always smiling through the glass. Against all reason, she fell in love. And in 1996, after nearly a decade of correspondence, Doreen Leoy married Richard Ramirez inside San Quentin prison. She wore a white dress, he wore a blue prison uniform. Reporters swarmed outside as if it were a celebrity wedding. "He's kind, funny, and misunderstood," she told journalists afterward. "He's not the monster people think he is." Her family disowned her. She didn't care. She said she'd found her truth in him. Ramirez thrived on the attention. The marriage gave him fresh headlines, new interviews, new followers. But Doreen wasn't alone. There were others. Dozens of women who sent him gifts, drawings, and even locks of their hair. He answered some letters, ignored others, but always kept the flow alive. It was his way of reminding the world that he still existed. Inside prison, he became something of a celebrity among other inmates. Guards said he was quiet, polite, rarely caused trouble. He spent most days reading about Satanism, art, and psychology. Occasionally he granted interviews, though most were short and cryptic. "I am beyond good and evil," he told one journalist. "I am what you fear you might become." When asked about the murders, he shrugged. "You can't kill death," he said. But time has a way of eroding all illusions. In the early 2000s, the cult of Richard Ramirez began to fade. The new century brought new killers, new scandals, new stories. Yet in the corners of the internet, especially as social media grew, his image began to re-emerge. Grainy black and white photos of him in court, his smirk frozen in time. On forums and later on YouTube, users shared documentaries about his crimes, dissecting his psychology, replaying footage of him shouting, "Hail Satan." For a generation that hadn't lived through the 1980s, Ramirez became myth again, a ghost resurrected through screens. It disturbed investigators who had worked the case. They couldn't understand why people were fascinated by him, why comments under his old mugshots said things like "he's hot" or "he has crazy energy." But fascination doesn't always come from admiration. For many viewers, Ramirez represented something else, the realization that true evil isn't a monster under the bed. It's a man who looks ordinary, who walks past you on the street. Meanwhile, life inside San Quentin continued to shrink. Decades passed in the monotony of prison routine. Ramirez and Doreen's relationship began to strain. She wanted appeals, wanted his freedom, but he didn't care. He told her he liked it inside, that this was his temple. When she pleaded for him to fight his sentence, he told her that death didn't scare him, that the electric chair or lethal injection would only make him stronger. "Energy doesn't die," he said. "It just changes form." By 2009, Doreen stopped visiting. The marriage quietly collapsed, though she never publicly confirmed a divorce. Ramirez didn't seem affected. He replaced her with new pen pals, new admirers who discovered him online. Among his letters were questions from students writing papers about psychology and criminality. He answered some of them with short, mocking lines. "You study monsters, I live it." The years weren't kind to him. His teeth had rotted completely, he wore dentures. His hair thinned and grayed. The once skinny drifter with burning eyes was now a pale, frail man walking the yard in prison blues. But his arrogance never faded. In 2010, during a rare court appearance for an appeal hearing, he smiled at cameras and whispered, "I'm still here." Then in 2013, the end came, not by execution but by disease. Ramirez was diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma, a form of cancer that slowly destroyed his body. For months he grew weaker, refusing most treatment, saying he didn't fear death. When he was transferred to Marin General Hospital, few people recognized him. The devil's disciple looked more like a skeleton wrapped in pale skin, his black hair now streaked with white. His eyes, once cold and predatory, had dulled into exhaustion. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at age 53. The cause was complications from cancer, along with chronic hepatitis C and decades of substance damage. He had spent 23 years on death row, never executed, never apologizing. When the news broke, there was no grand reaction, no collective gasp. Some of his victims' families expressed relief, others said it was too easy a death. One woman, whose parents had been among his first victims, said, "He didn't pay enough, but at least he's gone." His body went unclaimed for weeks. Doreen Leoy didn't appear. No family came. Eventually, his remains were cremated and quietly scattered in secret. No ceremony, no gravestone, just ash in the wind. For a man who had spent his life trying to be remembered, his ending was silence. Yet death didn't erase his presence. Online, his image only grew stronger. Documentaries were re-released, podcasts revisited his crimes, and new generations discovered him. Netflix's Night Stalker, the hunt for a serial killer in 2021, reignited the conversation, pulling viewers back into that summer of fear. Clips of his trial went viral again, the smirk, the pentagram, the words "Hail Satan" echoing across decades. People were horrified, fascinated, conflicted. Why does he still draw attention? Maybe because Ramirez represented a kind of evil that felt random, senseless. He wasn't hunting revenge or power in the usual way. He killed because he could, because it made him feel invincible. In a world obsessed with control, he embodied chaos. And for those who look at the dark to understand the light, he remains a case study of how broken a human soul can become. Behind all the media and mythology, though, the truth of Richard Ramirez's life is smaller, sadder. He wasn't born a demon. He was born a child, shaped by violence and trauma, twisted by influence, consumed by drugs and delusion until he became something monstrous. The evil he embodied wasn't supernatural, it was human. And that's what makes his story terrifying. Detective Gil Carrillo, in one of his last interviews before retiring, reflected on it years later. He said, "People think we caught a monster, but monsters don't exist. We caught a man who chose to be evil every single day." He paused and added, "That's worse." Frank Salerno, who had led the investigation, never forgot the case either. Even after decades, he said the memory of walking through those homes still haunted him. The silence, the smell of death, the fear that hung in the air. It wasn't just murder, he said. It was like he wanted to erase goodness. In that sense, the Night Stalker left a mark deeper than crime scenes or news headlines. He changed the way Los Angeles thought about safety. After his arrest, sales of home security systems skyrocketed. Families who had lived there in the mid-'80s said the city's innocence was gone forever. People stopped leaving windows open, stopped trusting the quiet hours before dawn. For an entire generation, night meant danger. Even now, decades later, people who lived through it still remember where they were when they first heard about the Night Stalker. They remember the police helicopters, the fear of footsteps outside, the way everyone seemed to look over their shoulder. It became a collective scar, a dark reminder that horror doesn't come from haunted houses or legends, but from flesh and blood. On YouTube today, old footage of his capture still racks up millions of views. The grainy image of his battered face in a newspaper, the crowd surrounding him, the headline "Night Stalker caught." It never fades. In the comments, people argue whether he was insane, evil, or just broken. Others discuss the mob that caught him, calling it the last moment of true vigilante justice. The footage is grainy, the voice is distant, but you can still hear the raw anger of that day, when ordinary people rose up against a man who thought he could kill forever. In that moment, the city fought back. The same Los Angeles that had lived in terror became his downfall. And maybe that's why his story still draws people in. It's not just about horror, but about the fragile balance between fear and defiance, between darkness and the will to survive it. Ramirez once told a reporter, "You can't kill me, I live in your nightmares." But he was wrong. Time killed him. The same world he tried to infect with fear eventually erased him into dust. The devil he worshipped never came for him.